In the spring of 1963, a young Spanish professor at the University of St. Thomas was organizing a missionary trip to Huehuetenango, Guatemala. He planned to take 5 UST students down to the Marinol headquarters there in Huehuetenango for 2 months of helping the Marinols in whatever way they could. This professor was Father Maurice Farge, CSB. The students that he selected to go with him were Nancy Rhodes, Ruth Torres, Bob Fauché, John Hosty, and myself, Pat Allen. This video is a reconstruction of some of the events of that project and what we experienced during it. It was quite a learning experience for me that I have never forgotten. One of the Houston diocesan priests loaned us his new Plymouth station wagon for the trip. So on May 27th, 1963, after a 4:30 a.m. Mass at the UST Chapel, we loaded up the Plymouth and headed for Laredo, Texas, where we planned to cross over into Mexico. We arrived in Laredo at 12:10 p.m. without any incidents. The Plymouth station wagon was loaded with 6 people, all their luggage, plus a considerable amount of medical supplies to be delivered to the Marinol house in Huehuetenango. This became a problem at the border. So after 6 hours of waiting and dealing with the Mexican border guards, we were not allowed to bring the medical supplies into Mexico. The supplies were left at a local parish where they would be later shipped down to Guatemala. So then we entered into Mexico at 6:30 p.m. on our way to Saltillo. And we arrived there at 1 a.m., May 28th, after a 19-hour day. So welcome to the trip. In the morning, we left Saltillo at 8:30 a.m., headed for Mexico City, and we arrived there at 9 p.m. It was a relatively uneventful day of 12 and a half hours. We spent the night at a Brazilian parish house near the Shrine of Guadalupe there in Mexico City. Day 3 took us from Mexico City to Puebla to see the beautiful historic cathedral there and then on to Oaxaca. It was a relatively easy day with one exception. The driving was almost all in the mountains. On a hilly curve, the driver, not to be mentioned by name, lost control in a curve and spun the Plymouth out on the highway. We were a little shook, but there was no injury or no damage, and no traffic coming the other way, thank goodness. We pressed on. After getting settled in at the motel in Oaxaca, some of us walked down to the town square to listen to the marimba music that was going on at the time in the gazebo on the square. It was quite good and my first introduction to the marimba bands. And marimba bands were quite popular in Guatemala also, as we found out later on. On day 4, 6:30 a.m., we heard the sounds of Father Farge dealing with the turista. We all knew when we signed on that it was going to be part of the trip. And then Nancy got it on the way out of town. Montezuma's revenge has just arrived. We pressed on, arriving in San Cristobal at 7:30 that night. And Father Farge went straight to bed. He was sick. John and I decided to go down to the motel restaurant and have a carta blanca. since we did not want to drink the water, of course. Day 5 started at 7 a.m. in the morning, en route to Guatemalan border, where we arrived at 11 that morning. After 4 hours of paperwork, we crossed into Guatemala at 3 p.m. that afternoon, and everyone was pretty excited in anticipation of arriving in Huehuetenango. We said goodbye to the paved roads of Mexico and started down the Pan American Highway at a top speed of 30 miles per hour. The road was gravel, rocky, bumpy, and that was the good road. Once we turned off the Pan American Highway, we started down the road to Huehuetenango. At that point, we were traveling between 10 and 15 miles per hour. We arrived at the hotel on the town square, Huehuetenango, at 7 p.m., May 31st, 1963. It had been 5 long days in the car and 2,010 miles, but we made it fine. The next morning, June 1st, a Saturday, I went to a local store and bought 2 tablets, of which I used to write a diary of our experiences on this project. And that is where I've gotten a lot of the details for this video. That afternoon, the Marinos rented a house just 1 block off the square for us to use while we were there. It was an 8-room home with a large open center patio where all the rooms opened into. You entered the house from the street through a short hallway into the open patio. None of the rooms had doors except one. We cleaned it up as best we could and moved in that afternoon. I was surprised that it was as nice as it was because I was expecting a lot worse. It did not have electricity, computers, phones, air conditioning, refrigeration, kitchen appliances, lights, carpet, Wi-Fi, fireplaces, or skylights. But we did have a wood-burning stove. And we used a Bunsen burner that the Marinos gave us for cooking. We did have some running water. And by that I mean we had a pipe in one room that was producing a little more than a trickle continuously. And there was a concrete basin in that room on the first floor that caught all the water. In order to get any water pressure, we had to pump the water up into the attic tank by hand. And this was a daily routine that the guys did for about half an hour each morning after the running water all night into the basin usually filled it. That would usually supply enough water for 1 or 2 showers and supply water for our toilet for the day. Needless to say, the guys did not get a shower that often. This house, by the way, was one of the nicest in the whole town. So, all in all, it was just fine. None of us were expecting a 5-star hotel. And we had it really good compared to what the Indian population was living in out in the rural areas of Guatemala, as we found out later. I will explain that shortly. The Marinos also supplied us with a cook. Her name was Soledad. And she would go out to the open market each day and select food from the vendors in the market, since there were no grocery stores in Huehue. She would then bring it home and cook it for us. And this was very necessary since a lot of the meat and other foods were just not sanitary. She knew what to watch out for in selecting the foods. And then occasionally we would cook up something special ourselves, like Ruth did with her banana bread. Man, was that good. And once Father Curtin brought us some cheese, and we had omelets for breakfast, and that was a rare treat. There was a wood-burning stove and oven in the kitchen, which required cut logs. And we bought wood from the local vendors who would cut it in the mountains and then carry it on their backs into town to sell. It always amazed me how much weight they could carry on their backs. One morning, a boy of about 12 years old came to our house selling a bundle of wood. It must have weighed at least 120 pounds. It was certainly more than what he weighed. So I bet John he could not lift the weight even though he was in good shape and quite a strong 21-year-old at the time. Well, after considerable difficulty, John proved me wrong by putting it on his back and held it long enough for me to take this picture. We had a good laugh about that. Our first job for the Maryknolls was to take a survey of the people in the homes in an aldea close to Huehuetenango. It involved walking from farmhouse to farmhouse and documenting the people living in each house. After that project, we settled into a routine each day of going out to Zacaleo and holding doctrine classes, saying the rosary, and showing religious slideshows to the local people. They were fascinated with what they called the cine. In order to be able to get out to the aldeas in the countryside, the Maryknolls provided us with a jeep that was able to navigate the rocky and often muddy, hilly roads. So each day we would load up our generator that was used to provide electricity for the slide projector and head out to Zacaleo. The children loved to get a ride in the Jeep, so we would take them on a short ride, 20 kids at a time. And then several times we went with the Maryknoll priest to take food and communion out to sick peasants in the country. The guys helped paint the hospital, and Nancy and Ruth helped Father Garvey with some paperwork for the Maryknolls. And the girls helped the Maryknoll nuns in town with some of their projects also. For me, our trip to Barias, Guatemala was the highlight and the most interesting part of the whole project. Barias was a small village, about 45 miles as the crow flies, north of Huehuetenango in the mountains of Guatemala. There was a Maryknoll parish there with two priests. They were Fathers Bill Woods and Dan McLeod at the time. Bob, John, and I were planning to make the 7-hour trip from Huehue on June 26, 1963. Father Woods had asked for some building supplies to be sent to Barias to support his efforts there. In the morning of June 26, Bob, John, and myself walked over to the Maryknoll headquarters where the driver and his truck were waiting to be loaded with the supplies. We loaded 1,000 pounds of tin roofing, 10 100-pound sacks of cornmeal, and about 600 pounds of other assorted supplies into the flatbed truck. We left Huehue late in the afternoon in the rain with the local driver. We stopped for the night about halfway up the mountain at a small town. And the three of us were in the back of the truck with a tarp over our heads. It was freezing cold and raining all night long. We didn't sleep at all because of the cold. I remember it was a miserable cold night. We finally got out of the truck at 5 a.m. to try and build a fire, but everything was too wet to get a fire started. And then shortly after that, the driver showed up, and we started for San Mateo at the breakneck speed of about 2 to 7 miles per hour through the mountains. We finally reached San Mateo in the afternoon, which is where the road ended. The Marinils had a small parish there, and Father Nichols was the pastor. It was a mostly pagan community with very few Catholic parishioners. The parish church had no roof, and the pagans worshipped right in front of the church at the base of these wooden crosses. All the supplies for Boreas would have to be unloaded and carried by hand the rest of the way into Boreas. We helped unload some sacks of cornmeal for Father Nichols, and then the driver took the truck to the end of the road. We visited with Father Nichols for about an hour, and he gave us some lunch. We had not eaten anything for about 18 hours. His chocolate cake was as hard as a rock, but we loved it. And then he drove us in the Jeep to the end of the road where the truck was being unloaded by about 50 Indians. Father Woods was sitting on his white horse, yelling out instructions to the Indians, half in Spanish and half in the Indian dialect. I'd never seen a priest dressed in jeans, jean jacket, and a black felt hat from a big white horse. It was quite a sight. And the Indians were swarming all over the truck and putting all the tin, flour, cornmeal, cement, and other supplies on their backs, and almost running down the trail to Boreas, 6 hours away on foot. It was an amazing sight to me to see these men carrying so much weight and moving so fast. Father Woods had bought 3 other horses for Bob, John, and I to ride back to Boreas. As we started down the trail, we were still high enough to be in the clouds, but occasionally we'd get a glimpse of the beautiful valley down below. After about 20 minutes of riding down the mountain trail through the clouds, we left the trail because Father Woods had to stop and make a sick call at a family's home, not far off the trail. We tied up the horses and went inside. It was a thatched hut with open sides and a fire on the bare ground in the middle of the room. There was so much smoke in the house it burned my eyes. Everything in the house was covered with thick black soot from the fire, including some dried food hanging from the rafters. There were about 8 people gathered around the fire. There was a young girl lying on a straw bed in the corner of the room. She was making spastic moves as Father gave her the last rites. He then talked with the family for a short while, and then we got back on the horses and headed for Boreas. Father Woods told us that this was a typical way of life with these Indians there in the mountains. We rode into Boreas about 5 p.m. We had the best meal since leaving the States a month earlier. It was topped off by a delicious piece of pie. We sat around talking to Father Woods and McLeod over a highball. Then we hit the sack about 11 p.m. in our nice private room with warm blankets. We really appreciated it after spending the previous night in that back of that truck. The next morning, Father Woods began to show us around. We visited the clinic where the priest would pull teeth, stitch up cuts, and almost everything else a doctor would do in the States. And then we entered the factory where 5 Indian carvers were carving beautiful religious figurines. Everything goes as planned. Their products will be sold in the States. And the plan is to train the Indians at the factory and then send them home to work in their own villages. John and I both bought a crucifix to take home, and you can see it here in this picture. They showed us the 4 model houses that they had built with adobe covered with cement. It had windows and closing doors and wood shingle roofs that would not leak. The homes were built for only $150 each, which the Indians could make selling their carvings. I was so impressed with both the ideas and efforts that Father Woods was doing to try to help these people. He had a level of dedication that I have not seen elsewhere in my 72 years. And this was just the beginning of his efforts. He took them to a whole new level in the years following our visit. 2 years after our visit in 1965, he learned to fly, to be able to get back and forth to Guatemala City and Huehuetenango more quickly with supplies and so forth. He made arrangements to purchase 100 square miles of jungle land in the Ixcan area of Guatemala and set up cooperatives and gave plots of land to over 2,000 Indian families. They had 5 schools with 13 teachers. They had 15 trained paramedics and 2 registered nurses. The cooperatives raised coffee and had over 1,000 head of cattle. He had 3 airplanes and pilots to fly supplies back and forth to the area, since there was no roads in there at that time. You can read about this venture online if you're interested. 11 years later, in 1976, he died tragically in a very suspicious plane accident involving the Guatemalan army. The Guatemalan government was not happy with his ventures to help the Mayan Indians at that time. On Sunday, June 30th, we helped Father McLeod in the clinic. Then that afternoon, 2 Indian parishioners led the 3 of us guys to a beautiful waterfall near Barrias, and we took some pictures that you see here and just marveled at the natural beauty. And then on Monday, July 1st, we rode out of Barrias at 8:30 in the morning, headed for San Mateo. We had lunch with Father Nichols and then on to Saloma and then Huehue. We arrived there about 5:30 p.m., just in time to go out to the aldea and hold our usual classes and show the movies. On Saturdays, we had some time to ourselves and had a chance to see some of the beautiful and interesting sights in and around Huehue. Here are a few examples of those. With a little sadness in our hearts, we said goodbye to Soledad, the Marinoles, and our new friends, and left Huehue at 6:30 a.m. on Friday, July 26th, headed back home. We stopped for the night in the same towns where we stopped on the way down. Plus, we made a fun side trip to Acapulco on the way back. We crossed the Mexican border on August 2nd, 1963.